The storm came without kindness and without warning, and it wrapped the town in thick white silence, and the roads disappeared, and the lights looked tired and weak against the wind, and Officer Ben moved slowly through the streets with his coat pulled tight, and his face burning from the cold, and he had been on duty for hours already, but something inside him told him not to rush home, and he trusted that feeling because it had guided him many times before, and his boots pressed deep into the snow, and every step felt heavier than the last, and the world around him felt empty, like everyone had vanished at once. The wind pushed against him and filled the air with sharp ice, and the sound of it made even strong buildings feel small, and Ben remembered stories of storms like this from his childhood, and how people used to say that snow could hide both danger and hope, and as he crossed an old bus stop near the edge of the street, he noticed a shape that did not belong to the storm, and it stood still while everything else moved. It was a little girl standing beside the bench, and she was holding onto a small dog, and her jacket was thin and pink, and already covered in snow, and her shoes looked wet, and her hands were stiff and red, and the dog stayed close to her legs with its head low and eyes alert, and Ben stopped walking because something about the stillness of the two felt wrong and too quiet. He took a slow step forward and raised his hand so she would not be afraid, and he spoke softly, even though the wind tried to steal his words, and the girl looked up, and her eyes were wide and tired and brave all at once, and she did not cry, and she did not move, and that worried him more than tears would have. Ben asked her name, and she answered in a small voice and said her name was Mia, and when he asked about the dog she said his name was Snowy, and the dog lifted his head when he heard it, and gave a small shake sending snow into the air, and Ben noticed how the dog pressed closer to the girl like he was trying to become her coat. Mia told him she had been waiting for the bus and that her mother worked late, and the bus never came, and the snow kept falling and falling, and she thought it would stop but it never did, and she stayed because she did not know where else to go, and Ben listened, and felt the cold reach deeper into his chest because time moved differently in storms like this, and minutes could feel like hours and hours could steal warmth and hope. He knelt in front of her to be closer to her height, and he could see how her hands shook even when she tried to hide it, and he told her she was very brave, and that she did the right thing by staying with her dog, and Mia looked down at Snowy, and nodded, and Snowy looked back at Ben, and wagged his tail once like he understood. Ben looked around and saw no cars and no people, and only snow and dark shapes of buildings, and he knew staying here was not safe, and he stood up and pointed down the street where a faint light glowed from a store far away, and he told her they would go somewhere warm and safe, and that he would stay with her, and he said the words slowly and clearly so she could hear them through the storm. He said, "Come with me," and held out his hand, and Mia hesitated for a moment, and then she reached out and took it, and her hand felt colder than the air, and Ben tightened his grip gently, and Snowy stood ready and stayed close to Mia's side, and together they turned away from the bus stop and into the storm. The walk was slow and careful, and Ben made sure to block the wind as much as he could, and he spoke to Mia as they walked to keep her focused and awake, and he asked her about school and her favorite food and Snowy, and she answered in short sentences, and sometimes she smiled and sometimes she just listened, and the sound of their footsteps was soft and steady. The storm tried to confuse them by hiding the road and changing the shape of the street, but Ben trusted his memory and his sense of direction, and he kept moving forward, and Snowy walked proudly like he was helping guide the way, and his small paws left marks that disappeared almost as soon as they were made. They reached a small store with a metal awning, and Ben led them underneath it, and the wind eased just enough to breathe, and he took off one glove and checked Mia's hands, and they were still cold but not numb, and he gave her his spare gloves, and she pulled them on and looked at him with quiet gratitude. Ben used his radio and called for help, and the sound cracked and faded and then returned weak but real, and he gave their location and explained the situation, and he waited and kept his voice calm, and Mia sat on a crate near the wall, and Snowy curled around her feet, and she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment. Ben stayed close and kept watch on the street, and he thought about how small moments could become big turning points, and how a simple choice to keep walking instead of driving home had led him here, and he felt thankful for that choice as the snow continued to fall around them. The lights in the distance grew brighter, and the sound of an engine pushed through the wind, and Ben stood and felt relief settle in his chest, and he looked down at Mia, and told her help was coming, and she opened her eyes and smiled softly, and Snowy lifted his head and wagged his tail, and the storm kept moving but they were no longer alone. The rescue truck stopped close to the store, and its lights cut through the storm like a promise, and Officer Ben waved his arm so they could see him clearly, and the door opened and warm air rushed out, and Mia stood slowly holding Snowy close, and Ben guided them forward and helped her climb inside, and the moment the door shut the sound of the storm became distant and softer, and the warmth wrapped around them, and Mia took a deep breath like she had been holding it for a long time. Inside the truck a blanket was placed around Mia's shoulders and Snowy was given one too, and he settled down quickly like he finally understood they were safe, and Ben spoke with the rescue team and explained everything, and they listened carefully and nodded and checked Mia's hands and face and told her she was doing very well, and she smiled shyly and looked down at Snowy who rested his head on her knee. As the truck began to move the road felt slow and careful, and the lights outside passed like quiet shadows, and Mia watched them through the window, and asked where they were going, and Ben told her they would go to a warm place where many people were waiting, and where they could find her mother, and Mia nodded and held her cup of warm drink with both hands, and the steam fogged her face for a moment. Ben sat across from her and kept talking softly to keep her awake and comfortable, and he asked her about her home and her school and her favorite games, and Mia answered, and sometimes paused to think, and sometimes smiled when she spoke about Snowy, and how he followed her everywhere, and how he barked at the door every morning like he was reminding her to wake up. Snowy lifted his head when he heard his name and wagged his tail, and the rescue team laughed gently, and one of them said Snowy was a brave dog, and Mia agreed and hugged him close, and Ben noticed how her hands shook less now, and how her eyes stayed open longer, and the color slowly returned to her face. The truck finally stopped at a large building with bright windows, and people moved inside wearing warm clothes and helping others, and Ben stepped out first and helped Mia down, and Snowy jumped lightly onto the ground and shook his fur, and the air here felt calmer and safer even though the snow still fell. Inside the building it was warm and filled with quiet voices, and the smell of hot food and blankets were stacked along the walls, and people sat together sharing space and comfort, and Mia looked around with wide eyes, and Ben stayed close and guided her to a table where a woman with kind eyes asked her name and wrote it down and asked about her mother. Mia spoke clearly and gave her mother's name and workplace, and Ben added details, and the woman nodded and told them they would make an announcement and search through their records, and Mia sat down, and Snowy curled up under the table and rested his head on her feet. Time passed slowly but gently, and Ben stayed nearby and watched Mia sip more of her drink and eat a small snack, and he felt a quiet hope growing, and he checked his radio and received updates about people being brought in from different parts of town, and he listened carefully for any mention that might connect to Mia's mother. Then suddenly a voice called Mia's name across the room, and Mia looked up quickly, and her eyes filled with light, and she stood before Ben could even react, and a woman rushed toward her with worry and relief written across her face, and it was her mother, and she dropped to her knees and wrapped Mia in her arms and held her tight. Snowy barked happily and jumped up and circled them, and the people nearby smiled and gave them space, and Ben stepped back and watched quietly as the two held each other, and the fear melted away, and Mia's mother thanked Ben again and again with tears in her eyes, and Ben nodded and said it was his job, but he felt something deeper than duty in that moment. Mia looked back at Ben and smiled and waved, and Snowy barked once more, and Ben raised his hand in return, and felt the weight of the night finally lift from his shoulders, and outside the storm continued, but inside warmth and safety filled the room, and Ben knew this night would stay with him long after the snow was gone. The shelter slowly grew quieter as the night moved forward, and people found places to rest, and the storm outside lost some of its anger, and Officer Ben stayed inside for a while longer, standing near the wall and watching the room, and he saw families reunited and strangers sharing blankets and warm food, and he felt the tiredness settle into his body in a gentle way. Mia sat beside her mother on a bench near the corner, and Snowy lay stretched out on the floor finally relaxed, and Mia's mother kept one arm around her like she might disappear again if she let go, and she thanked Ben once more and told him she had been stuck at work when the buses stopped, and her phone lost signal, and fear had followed her all the way to the shelter. Ben listened and nodded and told her that Mia had been very brave, and that Snowy had stayed with her the whole time, and Mia smiled proudly, and Snowy lifted his head like he understood every word, and the moment felt calm and full, and Ben realized that this was why he wore the uniform even on nights that tested his strength. After some time Ben stepped outside to check the streets again, and the snow had slowed to a steady fall, and the wind rested, and the town felt quieter and softer, and the lights reflected off the snow like small stars, and Ben walked slowly letting his thoughts move freely, and he thought about how close things had come to going wrong, and how a single choice could change the path of a night. His radio crackled with updates, and he responded and helped where he could, guiding others towards safety and warmth, and each small task added to the feeling that the storm was losing its grip, and when he returned to the shelter the lights felt warmer than before. Mia was awake and drawing with a pencil someone had given her, and she focused carefully on the paper, and Snowy watched her hand move back and forth, and Ben walked over and asked what she was making, and she told him it was a picture of the night, and she showed him shapes of snow, and a small figure holding a dog and a taller figure beside them, and Ben recognized himself even without details. He told her it was a beautiful drawing, and Mia smiled and added more lines carefully, and her mother watched quietly and thanked Ben again, and Ben felt slightly embarrassed but also honored, and he told Mia that she should always stay close to Snowy because he was a good protector, and Mia agreed strongly. The night moved on and people began to rest more deeply, and the shelter workers moved quietly offering blankets and checking names, and Ben received word that the roads would soon be cleared, and that morning would bring calmer skies, and the thought brought relief. Before leaving, Ben knelt beside Mia and Snowy, and told them he would check on them again before sunrise, and Mia nodded and held up her drawing, and told him she would give it to him later, and Ben smiled and promised he would be back. Outside the air felt lighter and the snow underfoot felt firm, and Ben walked the streets one more time and noticed how different everything looked now compared to the earlier hours, and the fear that once filled the storm had softened into quiet reflection, and he thought about how many people would wake up remembering this night for different reasons. When Ben returned near dawn, the sky had begun to change color, and pale light touched the snow, and the shelter doors opened, and people prepared to leave, and Mia ran toward Ben holding her drawing carefully, and she handed it to him with both hands, and the paper showed a simple moment filled with meaning, and above the figures she had written 3 small words that mattered more than she knew. "Come with me." Ben felt something warm rise in his chest, and he thanked her and folded the drawing carefully, and placed it inside his jacket pocket, and Snowy barked once and wagged his tail, and Mia laughed, and her mother smiled with quiet gratitude. As they stepped outside together, the storm was gone, and the town looked peaceful again, and Ben watched them walk away holding hands and moving toward home, and he stood still for a moment taking in the calm, and he knew that even when storms returned, this memory would remind him why he chose to keep walking forward. Morning arrived slowly and gently, and the sky turned pale and calm, and the town looked like a quiet picture made of white and light, and Officer Ben stood near the shelter entrance, and watched people step outside and stretch and breathe and smile with relief, and the storm that had once felt endless was now only a memory written into the snow. He felt tired in his bones, but his mind was clear and steady, and he thought about how the night had changed him in a quiet way, and how moments that seemed small could stay forever. Mia walked out holding her mother's hand, and Snowy moved proudly beside them, and her steps were lighter now, and her face carried warmth instead of fear, and Ben felt glad seeing that change. Her mother stopped and spoke softly and thanked Ben again and said she would never forget what he had done, and Ben replied that sometimes people help each other without planning, and that this night had done the same for all of them. Mia looked up at Ben and smiled and hugged Snowy, and then waved before walking away, and Snowy barked once like a goodbye, and Ben raised his hand and stood still until they disappeared down the street. The town slowly returned to its normal rhythm, and plows cleared roads and doors opened and voices filled the air, and Ben returned to his patrol and checked streets that now looked peaceful and safe, and he felt proud but humble knowing the storm could return any time. As he walked, he passed the bus stop where he first saw Mia and Snowy, and it looked ordinary again with no sign of fear or cold, and Ben paused for a moment, and remembered the quiet strength in Mia's eyes and the loyalty in Snowy's stance, and how trust had formed without words. He touched the pocket of his jacket where the drawing rested, and felt comfort knowing it was there, and he knew that drawing would stay with him long after the snow melted. The day continued, and Ben helped where he could and spoke with neighbors and listened to stories and laughter and relief, and each voice added to the feeling that the town had survived something together. When his shift ended, Ben walked home slowly and watched sunlight reflect off the snow and felt calm settle in his chest, and he realized that even in storms there could be kindness waiting to be found. At home he placed the drawing carefully on his table and looked at it again, and the simple shapes held a deep truth, and he smiled quietly and made a promise to himself to always keep noticing the small moments that mattered. Outside, the town moved forward, and inside Ben felt at peace knowing that one night in a blizzard had reminded him of why he chose to serve and why choosing to walk instead of turning away could change a life.